Welcome to Telegeography Explains the Internet, the show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I'm your host, as always, Greg Bryan from Telegeography, and today my guest is Waheed Adam, Global Board Director of the Mobile Ecosystem Forum and Executive Chairperson at iTouch Messaging Service. Our focus for most of this interview is on Africa, and I knew it would be, so I also invited my colleague Patrick Christian, who is our resident Africa expert at TG. Before we get into the conversation, I'll just give you some background. Waheed works in mobile in Africa, as you will hear, and is also deeply involved in the Mobile Ecosystem Forum. So I had him on the show to talk about his ideas around how mobile offers an opportunity for infrastructure development in less developed economies, particularly Africa, as that is where he is from and where his experiences that he wanted to share are. So he shared with Patrick and me some really interesting stories that did a great job of illustrating, I think, two core ideas. One, that mobile can be a valuable substitute for physical wireline infrastructure in some economies. And two, that mobile as infrastructure leads to some key innovations that end up having utility all over the world. So I'm looking forward to you getting the chance to hear him explain all of that. We also touched on hyperscaler and data center development in the region and how the industry is creating digital ecosystems within Africa. Then finally, he steered us to some discussion about how Africa presents the whole world with this resource of many young, innovative people who are hoping to become a resource for the world, and the role that telecoms can and should play in this revolution. So it's a really fun conversation, and I was happy to have Patrick along for Waheed, who was a great guest. So with that, let's get to the interview. Okay, I want to extend a very warm welcome to Waheed Adam. Thank you for joining us, Waheed.
Thank you very much for having me, gentlemen. I'm very pleased that the world wants to know more about Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is why I brought my colleague Patrick Christian along here too, who is our resident Africa expert at Telegeography. But Waheed, I thought it would be useful for us to start out the show with just if you could give us a brief background on yourself and what you do at iTouch Messaging.
All right. So for starters, I guess serial entrepreneur is a good way to say that's how I'm best described as. I've had multiple businesses in various sectors through my young entrepreneurial journey, and one that I started at the age of 22. So I don't know how it
Oh, wow.
feels to work somewhere. But
Yeah.
but yeah, I guess the technology world took me in the early 2000s, and I found it really interesting, not only for opportunity to run businesses, but I guess in a world that is changing dramatically, and how technology was influencing that change.
Right.
So yeah, once I jumped on board, that's it. The ship never stopped sailing.
I
So,
mean,
so
that's what you want to do, right? Is ride the waves. So
exactly.
yeah.
So iTouch is, for want of a better expression, an aggregator. So we very much in the A2P messaging business, very much the kind of, if you wish, the digital postman. So anything digitally that you need posted, be it SMS, email, using technologies like USSD or rich media messaging, that's the kind of stuff we do. And
Gotcha.
with a key focus on the African continent, but also beyond borders.
Gotcha. Now you're also, and I think probably the focus of the conversation here will relate back to maybe this position a bit more, but the global board of directors of the Mobile Ecosystem Forum. Now, I've had people from the Metro Ethernet Forum on the show before, so I want to make clear when we say MEF or MEF here, we're talking about the Mobile Ecosystem Forum. Could you just tell us a little bit about that MEF and what you're doing there?
All right. So MEF is a global trade body that represents everything in the mobile world. Right. So it's not in any specific sector, whether it be messaging or private data security or, IoT. It kind of covers the broad spectrum in terms of everything mobile. and represents the global environment. So it really tries to take what's happening around the world and aggregate that into best practices, white papers, things like code of conducts, and also bringing that information together, as well as the mobile world together, allows us to kind of all jump onto one ship, trying to achieve something great. Then all on our little yachts going in different directions. So it's very much that sort of environment. I have been on the board since 2017, when we initially had a separate board for the EMEA region, that's Europe, Middle East, and Africa, until it was decided that it was best we have one that represents the globe, and I've been on since 2017. Although my role covers the world, I mean that's what we do. I have a specific passion for the African continent, and as mandated by MEF, we also want to bring Africa more into the fold. So I'm charging that lead, if you wish, and hope we can bring it out. So conversations like this are very welcome and very important to us.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we're very glad you joined us, and yeah, that's a good segue into sort of bringing up the major topic for the day, which is about Africa, but I think certainly has lessons that can be applied to the whole world, and just looking at kind of mobile as infrastructure. So when I was first introduced to this topic by you, I was thinking back, and Patrick, you may be able to help me out here, but I remember looking at we have at Telegeography something called the Global Comms, which is just consumer data about telecoms penetrations and whatnot by country around the world. And if I think back to probably like 15 or so years ago, maybe around the start of the 2010s or so, around that zone, I noticed that the mobile penetration rates for several countries in Africa exceeded those of many countries in Europe at the time, and that there had clearly been this sort of adoption back then of, I guess, 2 or 3G kind of technology among the African consumers that was still lagging in other places. And thinking through that, it's like, okay, well, they have access to broadband wireline, and it's still the case now, from what I see in the data, that wireline penetration in many African countries is very low. And when I say very low, household penetration rates might be in the single digits in some countries, but mobile penetration rates are above 100%, right? So I wonder if you could sort of flesh out for us that history of how mobile adoption sort of supplanted the rollout of wireline physical infrastructure.
All right. So one is, when you look at the world map and you see the size of Africa to the rest of the world, it doesn't appear to be the actual size it really is.
Of course, Mercatus projection, right?
Yeah, exactly. The world map was drawn by those that lived in other parts of the world.
Right.
If you look at the size of Africa and you take each continent, including the US, you take Europe, you take Japan, you take a number of the other, India, collectively they'll all fit into Africa. And I mean that collectively, right? And so when you have the geography of a continent that large, then obviously the rollout of infrastructure is going to cost a whole lot more. The second part of that is that each country, as we know, Africa is not the richest continent in the world by far. And this kind of opportunity or financial burden to a state in order to roll out infrastructure has just been impossible, right? So understand it from the cost, it just wasn't going to happen. When you start looking at stories like, and maybe I should give you a quick story if you don't mind.
Please, yeah.
I go into Central African Republic, right? It's a country that's surrounded by Cameroon. It's just above the equator, and it's landlocked. And I ended up with an investment there that I had to go and visit. And I go to one of these rural parts of the world, which there wasn't even roads to get to. We had to take a chopper to get to it. And there is a death in the village. And the story goes like this, is that the tribe or the community elected one of the sons to then go and inform the rest of the family. So this is what he had to do. He had to pack a little bag over his shoulder, and he took a 3-day bushwalk to get to one of the main arterial roads And he had to time it in such a way that he gets the bus that only goes past there once a week. And then he got the bus, and then he traveled into the capital, Bangui, where he then goes over to the radio station, who has what they call community hour. And in that community hour, they read out all the messages. And usually it's, when someone has died as well. And that's how the rest of the country or the family gets to find out, well, grandpa has died.
Right. That
He
is not the
then
speed of business. Yeah.
No, and he then takes
Yeah.
that same journey back, right? So
Yeah.
and then the rest of the family all convenes into the village, and then they dig up the body from the shallow grave along the river so it doesn't decay, and then they have the proper burial. Now,
Hmm.
that is a real story. That is how
Right.
it used to happen.
Hmm.
When GSM came out, and of course, a lot more doable than wide infrastructure. And of course, the rural areas weren't covered immediately. But you
Hmm.
can then imagine the convenience of, even at a high cost, because it's a cost a lot more in Africa, if you know that.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
was still cheaper than the exercise itself.
Of
And even
course. Of
even if
course.
you were going to visit a friend of yours, it was cheaper to make a call, or if you were literate, to send an SMS when people adopted SMS, to
Mm.
find out if your friend is there before you actually embarked on the journey to get there, being it taxi or whatever means of transport you took. So
Right.
the convenience of communication, even though expensive, became a lot more uh, um, convenient and cheaper
Yeah. Yeah.
in
Hmm.
what you would have had to do. So the adoption was so rapid that even, Vodacom is one of the biggest networks in South Africa, and
Right.
the initial CEO, who was CEO for many years, is actually hailed quite a hero in South African telecoms. And the reason why he's hailed such a hero is, I don't think anybody, if you were heading an MNO at that time, could do anything wrong. And let me explain what I mean. His first business plan said that there would be a market cap of subscribers for all networks of 750,000 people.
Hmm.
That was his first business plan. They did that in 3 months. He then,
Yikes.
of course,
Yeah. Right.
altered his business
Yeah.
plan, and he
Yeah.
changed it to 3.5 million people. They did that in the following 9 months. He
Wow.
then changed it
Wow.
to 7.5 million people, and they did that in the following year. He stopped changing his business plan and just rode the wave that made him look this hero, because his shareholders were ecstatic, and they didn't care he was wrong, because he was positively wrong, right? He was like,
Right. Right.
he was on the wrong end of it, and they're making a lot more money. Um, but no one quite truly understood the importance of communication, even
Hmm.
though it was so much more expensive. The other thing is that South Africa, if we used it in the early days of comms, has a very small bankable market. It's a lot changed today, but I'm going back into the mid 90s. And the unbanked market didn't have a credit record that was worthy of getting a contract.
Right.
So the invention around prepaid airtime came
Prepaid, yeah.
about as a result to serve that community. A South African
Hmm.
invention, which now serves 80% of Europe, if I last
Right.
remember, and it's about 85% of Africa. But that cost to distribute that prepaid airtime had a charge, which therefore traditionally was always going to cost you more. But even though we can deliver it digitally today, right, low cost,
Hmm.
people are still
Hmm.
paying more for a prepaid airtime service, because that's what the networks are happy to do, right? They don't care if they charge and make a lot more money. But the bottom line, people still pay the high price because of the convenience of communication.
Right. Absolutely. No, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that that story provides a lot of color for why we would have seen those numbers a while ago. And one thing that we think about at telegeography, and certainly most of our listeners are coming from sort of carriers, systems integrators, that kind of thing, as well as the end user side, sort of putting together networks there. But obviously, one of their great pain points is local access, right? So it's always the last mile that's the most difficult part of any journey, and that's true whether you're in the logistics business or whether you're in telecoms or whatever. And so it seems to me that's of course, when you're describing building out towers in like Central African Republic or whatever, you're pulling wires to those towers, but then that tower takes care of the most
The
difficult
last mile.
part of that
Mhm.
last mile bit. And so it seems like the economics really work out
Yes.
in that sense
Right.
for both parties, right? So
And when we're talking about broadband, especially in Africa, we're talking about mobile. We're not talking about fixed.
Yes.
So
right.
that's what we see, and that's even today. It's still up over. These are telegeography numbers, but 90% penetration or of penetration population for mobile, and for all of Africa for fixed broadband, it's about 10%. But of course, Africa is huge, and you're looking at several different markets, because if you
Mm.
take North Africa, which is a completely different region, out of it, they have fixed broadband penetration rates from 30 to 50%. And South Africa is its own region that's a little bit apart too. But if you look at the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, that's where you're seeing the numbers you were saying, Greg, about 5% in the single digits and often the low single digits. So when we're talking about broadband, we're talking about mobile. I think that's a super important point. And even today, if just looking at the numbers, Africa is still growing the fastest in terms of globally, in terms of mobile subscription. But
Mhm.
kind of the new thing that we're starting to see happening is a lot more rollout of the fixed broadband, but fiber to the home. But that's just tiny numbers compared to mobile subscription numbers.
So
Absolutely.
by that I mean, Patrick, just to be clear, you mean like fixed wireless access. So like having
Correct.
a like there you would be
Well,
using
no,
a or
both. I'm
potentially,
talking about fixed
Fiber.
broadband and versus right.
Mhm.
I'm talking about well, I mean, it can be DSL, any of the fixed broadband.
I see. I see.
It can include wireless as well, but what we're
Mhm.
looking at a lot of growth in is actually the fiber to the home is really starting to take off. But like I
Yes.
said, the numbers are infinitesimally small compared to the mobile
Yeah.
subscribers.
Right.
Often, Patrick, the fiber cables get to main urban zones, and even from a certain point where it stops, they're still using mobile broadband,
Mobile
for the last
broadband.
mile. Yeah. So
Mm-mm.
Right.
that's kind of the intermediate stage, is
Mhm.
get fiber into the main zone and then use mobile broadband for the last mile, and then
Right.
slowly start connecting each home with fiber cables.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that's also happening right
Yeah.
now. Hmm. South Africa is
Yeah,
a
that
little
makes a
ahead
lot
of
of
that
sense.
right now in parts, particularly the main urban zones. But then there's the rural zones and some of the outlying urban areas that are still getting that sort of fiber connectivity coming.
Mhm.
It's still very dependent on GSM.
Very. And
Yeah.
looking at the numbers of the different generations too, Africa, I believe, is the only region that over 30%, 35, 36% is still 2G. But that just
Mm.
shows there is the connectivity. But we're seeing, the big change over to 4G in a lot of areas, but 3G is so it's like a third,
Yeah, including 5G. So 5G
starting
is
5G. Yeah.
right. South Africa's got 5G. I know Kenya's got 5G. So East Africa, South Africa, North Africa has had some amazing growth in terms of technology advancements. Then there are other parts, like you said, sub-Saharan and parts of West Africa that are still quite behind the curve. But
Mhm.
yeah, uh, as I think governments realize the importance of connectivity and the impact it's already having in terms of economic growth, so
Right.
they're realizing the need to actually speed up the process of spectrums and regulation policies and so
Mhm.
forth in the mobile industry.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
like,
that's a great point, Waheed. That I think one of the keys here is that and I mean, even here in the U.S., we have a new sort of broadband initiative because we can see that having access to the internet is the one of the best economic engines you can have now, and so even the operators, right, should be happy about that. But in Africa, we've seen that develop. I think, as you have put it, as a sort of mobile first economy. I was wondering if you could sort of lay that out for us and describe how these infrastructure developments being mobile led to this kind of different style of economic activity, if that makes sense.
Let me give you another nice story. Is
Yeah,
South
please.
Africa?
Stories are great. People remember stories. We talk about data all the time. People want to hear stories. So yeah.
One of the big networks in South Africa develops this fintech solution and decides that mobile money is the way South Africans are going to adopt banking. Now, for those who don't know, South Africa's banking sector is robust and has been in the top 10 for many a decade
Hmm.
globally. In fact, a lot of our banking systems were far more advanced than the US banking system when I visited the US, and it was so surprised that people were still writing checks. So,
Yes. Yes.
so,
Yeah.
they launched this particular mobile money project and it failed, right?
Hmm.
And then they took it to Kenya. And
Mm.
if you know the word M-Pesa, this is the technology I'm referring to. And they launched it in Kenya. And it got so fast into market, right? The adoption rate was phenomenal that it
Hmm.
runs a third of Kenya's GDP today.
Wow.
Right
Yeah.
now, what
Amazing.
happened? Why and just maybe to add, they then said, okay, it's working now, we'll launch it again in South Africa, which they did, and it failed yet again, and there was a third time and it failed yet again. They've given up. But
Mm.
what's the difference? South Africa's banking sector, retail banking sector, like I said, is robust. It had access. People, there's an ATM on every third corner in the cities.
Right.
You can easily get access to your money. But when you go to countries like Kenya, they don't have the same retail banking infrastructure, right? So people had less access. So the minute M-Pesa came about, all of a sudden there was access to their money through the mobile wallet. But beyond that, so that was the adoption reason. But beyond that, there's this, for example, vendor, say this woman who is selling bananas on the side of the road, a lot of informal economies, right?
Hmm.
And she would be able to buy, using a bit of the cash she had, um, a couple of boxes of bananas, sit on the side of the road, and that's her daily sale. All of a sudden, she could now pay for these bananas she was buying digitally through the mobile wallet.
Hmm.
Okay. And people buying the banana didn't need to have cash. They could actually just make an instant transfer while at the vendor. And this trading started becoming a lot easier.
Hmm.
Then the likes of Safaricom, who actually launched M-Pesa, Safaricom is one of the biggest networks in Kenya, started providing sort of micro credits, right? So instead of buying two boxes of
Hmm.
bananas she sold daily, she could buy a third and a fourth. And she could sell quicker because people were paying with mobile money. They didn't need cash. So all of a sudden, her business grew.
Right.
And that is essentially, now her business doubled as an informal trader, which is
Hmm.
largely what makes up their country. Can you
Right.
imagine what happened to their economy? And if you
Hmm.
look at the stats of Kenya's growth economically, it's been tremendous.
Right.
It's a big success story. And that fintech kind of enabled it. And that's
Hmm.
why mobile first in that regard, is so fast adopted.
Led to different
Yeah.
innovations in different
Right,
markets.
exactly. That's exactly how I was going to put it, Patrick. That you have a laboratory for innovation that we almost don't have in other markets because there's not the need for them, right? And so
Right,
need
right.
is what drives innovation, right? But these are things that other markets, it seems to me, would be happy to adopt, later on. So there's this, I
Correct.
think, clear opportunity for the world to work with these African
Yeah.
operators and even retail banking institutions to see how these innovations can play out and benefit them,
Yeah,
even
and kind of
in other regions.
a piggyback example of that too. I think it was in Kenya as well. I remember many years ago, like 8 years ago, we were talking about a new app that you paid for parking on your phone,
Mhm.
and this was years ago. And now I see, just in the past couple of years, I see it a lot in California and the U.S. We're like,
Yeah.
oh, we were doing that in Kenya like 8 years ago, 9 years ago.
Hmm.
And born out of a need, right? Because
Yeah,
again,
Right.
correct.
you needed coins. You didn't have access to retail banking easily. And well, if the parking meters were able to be lifted and stolen, there was a probability of that. So how do you save all that?
Hmm.
Hence the
Right.
solution.
Yeah. Innovation.
And just so you know, I mean, M-Pesa has now been adopted in other countries like Rwanda, for example, another very success story, and some leadership that's taking onus of economic growth in that country. Rwanda is aspiring to becoming another major economy. Their GDP growth over pre-COVID, I would say, was 8%. So again, how technology is influencing the economy.
Yeah.
Right.
So Waheed, what role do you think the providers themselves can play in this? I mean, obviously, when listening to these stories, it strikes me that price point is really important here, because the ability to pay is going to drive sort of how much data they can consume and all that. How do you think operators should think about these innovations and that they're this mobile economy and can they keep prices low enough to keep sort of fostering this kind of innovation?
All right, I'm not going to pull any punches with that question. Let me put
I wouldn't expect you to. So this is a safe zone. You can.
Well, let me put it to you this way, right? I think first, when you look at a board of a company or corporation, any board's mandate is really about looking after the interest of the shareholder. Right? That's the mandate of
quarterly
a board,
profits
globally.
Right? Yeah,
it's all about the interest is a nice way of saying profits. So that's the mandate of a board, and the executive team of a company is there then to implement that mandate and make sure that they do it with the board being this kind of overseer, if you wish, to ensure that they do it as intended. Now, to me, that's where the first problem lies: is that a board's mandate needs to shift to one of sustainability and inclusion. And when I say sustainability, you got to look at this as a long game. You got to say, all right, if I make less profit, in to answer your question now, the MNOs should make less profit. If I make less profit and I stimulate that economy, then ultimately, in the long run, I become a more sustainable business, right? In an environment that is thriving, and I serve the shareholders with great interest in the long run.
Right.
And when that mandate changes to sustainability and inclusion, and when I say inclusion, I then refer to firstly the employees of that business, and then I go to the broader community of the employee market, in other words, the family, the household of each employee, and then the community that supports that business. Right? So that inclusion means I'll give better value to that community that serves my business in a way that I create a sustainable business.
Right. Yeah.
So we need to address it from that perspective, number one. Number two is that governments and political leaders need to understand that investing in these businesses in order to enable their economy, right, means that they can't just rest on the private sector to carry this all out and wait for taxes. They must actually come to the party and say, all right, we understand this promotes the economy. We'll get rid of the duties to import the infrastructure you require in order to roll out the towers or the fiber cables, etc. And perhaps even subsidize the cost of that. The return on that.
Or how about spectrum too? I mean, do you have any thoughts on how spectrum is allocated in Africa specifically or elsewhere that could facilitate this?
Well, it goes up at auction, right? But it goes up when government decides it's needed, and when the industry is putting so much pressure on it to give in. I mean, South Africa's just gone to auction now with the 5G spectrum. I mean, this should have happened, considering our advanced stage of development in this sector. This should have happened ages ago. Why did it sit in government? What were they waiting for? And why do they look at the economic figures unhappily and say, well, we expected more out of it? Well, you didn't do the things you needed to do in order to stimulate it. Right? So that's precisely what I'm talking about. Everything government needs to ensure that there's ease of policy, that yes, it's regulated, but it's done in a way to promote growth, that if the networks or the private sector require the tools in order to roll this out, meaning spectrums or licenses or any other feature of that, like import duties being gone, then those are the kind of things governments can do in order to stimulate that implementation.
Hmm.
And I think
And
that's when you will see,
right.
the value coming through.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that something that MEF would work on, or MEF is really just working on the industry itself? But would there be a sort of aspect of trying to convince regulators that you share best interests?
No doubt. Um,
Hmm.
in for example, South Africa, I mean, we have strong networks, and they don't love each other. They don't talk to each other much, Um, so they all suffer the same pains, but because they won't share that information and collaborate, well, the people suffer along with them.
Right.
And in more recent years, we got them all together with some of the industry in terms of aggregators like iTouch, and we also got the banking regulator in. Right, so there's a banking organizer or
Mm.
association of banks that come together under a brand called Sabric. And we put them all in a room and we said, look, it's time to talk. In particular, we were talking about fraud and
Right.
the impact of fraud in the industry, because that's a threat to the industry as a whole when
Hmm.
your customers stops trusting the service.
Trust, exactly. Yeah.
And the networks then announced that they were in talks to form this body called Comric, which was a association of networks. Well, it's just been recently, and this is a few years later now, announced that this body's been formed. Now, as MEF, we're trying to make headway to have this conversation again that we picked up pre-COVID. And COVID, of course, stopped a lot of that conversation. And there's a new incoming CEO now. Yeah, so it's already being restructured. And it's almost as though, there's less urgency about this collaboration, even though it's well-intended and they realize they got to do it. So, yeah, I think to answer your question, is MEF is playing a role in trying to bring these bodies together so that they can really understand that we're all playing in the same game. And it takes, if we're playing soccer, it takes 22 players on the field in order to make this work, and not just one or two.
Hmm.
So
Right.
yeah, MEF is playing in that field, or that sphere.
And are you seeing changes now, talking about kind of more collaboration and working together? What we're seeing on the international level, because we track our focus is more on international cross-border. What we're seeing is a lot more development of national and international networks, that not just submarine networks, because very often when we talk about international networks for Africa, it's really the submarine cables where
Right.
you're getting a lot of the capacity and the traffic that's international. But we've seen a lot of growth in the cross-border terrestrial, and a lot of this has been stimulated, what we've seen anyways, with the cloud service providers or the content providers moving in, investing, et cetera, trying to make bigger, more redundant networks, better performance, et cetera. And then we've seen since about 2019, the cloud data centers going in with Microsoft, AWS, Oracle, and now an announcement with Google. And we're starting to see traffic patterns change. I'm wondering if you're seeing it at any level changes with, for example, your business and collaboration, et cetera, with the movement of these content providers coming in.
Yes, absolutely. As the continent lights up, so I think the international community, right, and I mean off the continent as well, are beginning to see what is happening on the ground, what opportunities are coming out. Some of these stories are now being publicized, which again, your platform is doing. Thank you for that. And
Hmm.
and as the world sees it and realizes there's opportunity here for growth in their already strained markets, right, where competition is rife, where margins are low, here's an opportunity to get into a brand new economy, in a sense, a brand new economy. If you do
Hmm.
the right things, I'm going to make money. And
Right.
in that, we're seeing African stories like a few unicorns that have now come to light and are making world news. We're seeing technologies that have been African problems solved, now solving European or Western problems,
Hmm.
US and so forth. We're starting to see innovation hubs from the likes of Sweden, from the likes of Europe, from the likes of the US, all aiming, including the East, aiming at Africa, where they can kind of bring together a community of smart young people that have great solutions for the continent, and it's very much around the social impact as well. And they're focusing on things like agri and water and those kind of things. And they're creating these hubs where they can then transfer skills, but also take the opportunity of early investing and then scaling these opportunities, which unfortunately the local entrepreneur is unable to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So innovation hubs are plenty, are kind of getting onto the continent, and then you got, like you said, the Googles and Amazons and all of those that are ensuring that they're part of that game in a bigger infrastructure way, but also creating innovation hubs of their own, and these are coming with entrepreneurship programs that give learnings on how to develop your business, on how to run a business, other than just having a great idea. So clearly, there's opportunity from that perspective, and it's being noticed. The other side is that as the continent lights up and connectivity lights up, and all of a sudden there's a new customer, then someone in the world is saying, hey, maybe they need a funeral policy, an insurance policy, or a micro loan, or whatever the case may be. So as an aggregator, as iTouch, we've had a number of businesses on the continent. So we kind of understand its complexities. We understand the policies and procedures of starting a venture in a country, the local business culture. And because we have this information and, of course, the connectivity that we have with the networks, we're finding that a lot of international aggregators like ourselves are actually coming to us and asking us to deliver their communication onto the continent. Now, firstly, they wouldn't be doing that if there wasn't an opportunity, and they're clearly seeing it. But two, in many instances, when they've tried to do it themselves, as I said earlier, it's a complex environment, that they found that the cost of trying to do it yourself far outweighs than simply working with a company that knows the sector. And therefore, people like us, or companies like ourselves, we certainly seeing the growth of international customers that want to do business in Africa coming through us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think thinking of this from the sort of economist perspective, everything you're talking about, Waheed, it seems to me is really all around reducing friction, right? And it's you like making transaction costs lower, all those kinds of things. And one of the big frictions for telecoms in Africa was the giant trombone back to Marseille, right?
Yes,
or
precisely.
Frankfurt, right? So the less we can do that, it's cheaper and it's faster and it's more efficient for those smart people that are in Africa that are going to be innovative than when they have the opportunity to be able to have low latencies and things like that. I think it's going to be really effective, right? So
I was just going to say, when I talk about Africa being this opportunity, do understand we're talking about a population of 1.4 billion people.
Right.
1.4 billion people. And the average age, get this, is 20.
Holy cow.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
It's like so much potential. Yeah.
Make that internet work.
And when you're talking about 20 years old, bearing in mind that these kids have grown up in a semi-digital world.
Right.
It's part of the DNA, right? So mobile adoption, to your earlier question, is why the adoption's so great, is almost second nature to us right now.
Right.
And it's a young population that also had got better education compared to their parents, and understand the problems that they're facing, and how can technology solve that? And that's where the big players also coming in.
And Patrick, you had a thought there too?
Oh, I was just going to kind of go a little bit further on what you were saying about tromboning and prices, is that, like I was saying, with the content providers actually moving in right now, and this is what I was just in Kigali speaking about this, is how it's the data center kind of gold rush right now across Africa, trying to build out locations where you can keep content local. So, and there's a lot of interest in this. A lot of this is driven by the content providers. They kind of create their own ecosystems, but just across the board. And they're going to be in a lot of carrier neutral data centers as well. So I think in the last year and going forward, I think there's 20 major data center sites that are in the process of being built. And we are seeing the effects because we track capacity, international capacity, where it goes. We're seeing that now, instead of going up back up to Europe for content, we're seeing, for example, from Kenya and Nigeria going down to South Africa. So now we're seeing a lot more intra-African capacity building, and this lessening of reliance for sub-Saharan Africa on Europe. I think it's dropped from 80% to down to about 60% of all international capacity goes back up to Europe. So we're seeing a lot of the intra growing. And what does this do? It also makes lowers prices because you don't need as much IP transit. And it increases performance because once you have the content close to you, everything works better. If you watch a video, it's much easier if the data center is within a few milliseconds and not going all the way up to Europe. So we're seeing a lot of changes.
I think, Patrick, you made a very good point there in the sense of relevant content, right? So initial stages of it, and this go back again to the growing economies, right? Because the initial stage of connectivity was, well, what's on the internet? What is there available? So it was everything European or US or Chinese or, 10 cents and so forth. But all of a sudden people are going, but hold on, how do I get local music? And then some entrepreneur locally goes, hey, hold on, I can do my own kind of Spotify thing. And there's been a number of efforts around, local streaming of music. There's also Nigeria's got what they call Nollywood. It's a massive industry,
Right.
And all of a sudden I can watch local content that comes out of that. So relevant content is also spurning the kind of growth in the industry because it's content that appeals to me and that is relevant to me. So a very good point you make there, Patrick.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Waheed, just to wrap things up, I just wanted to sort of hit this final point of that. We've mostly been talking about how all of this plays out in Africa. It definitely strikes me that there's lessons for the whole world here. The whole rest of the world has less developed, rural places where the last mile is either prohibitively expensive or not there yet. What can we take away from this for whether it's rural U.S. or a developing tier 3 city in China or whatever the case may be? What would you say to those folks sitting in those markets, basically?
Well, for starters, 1.4 billion people, average age 20 years old. The continent is lighting up. There's certainly downward pressure on pricing. And as people are getting connected, they're realizing what technology can do to change, firstly, their own situation. And as such, some of the technologies coming out of that are being, made into world solutions. Innovation hubs and investment. A lot of the investment funds, we haven't spoken about that, are also setting up shop here, looking at how they can get involved with this market, and through that scaling these opportunities. So if you go into the pioneers that got into the gold rush back in the day with their horse and cart and spade and barrel and little sieve, well, I think Africa is representative in this sector in the mobile world in the same way. In the sense that even though there's already success stories and some heartbreak stories, I'm sure, not every gold digger found gold, but it is that time where Africa's opportunity is coming. The GDPs in countries are growing. The population is young and therefore adopting technology, readily that's available for them. And if you want to look at a market that has that kind of potential, Africa certainly is it. If you were to enter it, then do your research, as they say every time, do your research. And no doubt, pay the consultants, no doubt, pay the experienced corporations or companies or aggregators like ourselves in order to assist your growth, because the alternative route has cost many a dollar. And don't be fooled that you think you know it all. It is a complex environment, but it's an exciting one. So we welcome you.
Excellent. Well, I think, Waheed, you might need to add, a chief evangelist for African telecoms to your CV there. It's, Yeah. So thank you very much. This was a delight, and I learned a lot, certainly. If listeners want to keep up with your work, Waheed, is there a place they can find you out there, LinkedIn or something else?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, so that's probably the best way to find me, Waheed Adam. And please connect with me. I'm open. And
Excellent.
anyone needing anything, any input or advice, I'm here for it. And if I can't, I'll provide someone who can.
Yeah, I mean that's the real key is connections, right? So that's what we've been talking about this whole time. Yeah,
Exactly.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Waheed. That was super interesting. Hope you can join us again sometime. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for
Thanks,
having me,
Waheed.
gentlemen. All the best.
Thanks for listening. Telegeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at Telegeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.